A wind gauge recorded 100 miles an hour, then blew away before it could measure any higher. Steel transmission towers folded like tin foil under nothing but ice. A blizzard dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an afternoon and froze children within sight of shelter. One of these storms built its own tornadoes out of solid flame. The city built on denial. Isaac Klein had told his neighbors for years that a serious hurricane could never reach Galveston, Texas. On September 8, 1900, he stood at the water's edge and watched something wrong. Waves rolling in from the southeast while the wind blew from the north, the tide climbing the beach against the current it should have followed. Forecasters had tracked the storm for days, but did not know it was strengthening toward Texas, and nobody anticipated how high the tide would climb. Klein raised hurricane flags and warned people near the beach, but the bridges to the mainland failed before a citywide evacuation could happen. The storm surge, ocean water pushed ashore by the hurricane, crested near 15 feet, enough to swallow a one-story house up to the roofline. Winds tore past 130 miles per hour, tearing the city's own wind gauge off its mount right after it logged that reading. Put yourself on Broadway Avenue that evening, with roof slate cutting past like thrown axes while entire houses slammed into the next block, one collapsing into another. The water itself turned into a weapon, crushing as many people as it drowned.
Around 8,000 people died, more than any other natural disaster in American history. Survivors could not bury the dead fast enough, and the city was forced to burn its own streets. The storm that outran cars. Murfreesboro, Illinois, was a booming railroad and coal town on March 18, 1925. The kind of place with brick schools and busy depots.
Then a tornado nearly a mile wide crossed 3 states without stopping, and Murfreesboro took the worst of it. 234 people killed in one town alone. At the time, the Federal Weather Bureau forbade its own forecasters from using the word tornado in public warnings, worried the panic would cause more harm than the storm. So nobody in its path had any real warning at all. The funnel averaged 62 miles in 1 hour, faster than a 1920s automobile could reliably drive, which meant outrunning it by car was rarely possible. Picture yourself anywhere along its track. The ground would have shaken a mile off as the pressure dropped so hard that a pressure recorder inside a coal mine traced the anomaly. In DeSoto, 33 students died when their schoolhouse walls came down around them. The tornado's path stretched 219 miles, roughly the distance from New York City to Washington, D.C., without a real break. Some meteorologists now suspect it may actually have been several tornadoes born from the same storm, rather than one continuous funnel, though official records still list it as a single track. The blizzard after fall spring. The morning of January 12, 1888, felt like spring across the Nebraska and Dakota prairie, warm enough that children left home without coats. That warmth was exactly the problem. Cold air swept down from Canada in the early afternoon, and within hours the temperature plunged more than 40 degrees Fahrenheit, about the gap between a refrigerator and a home freezer, while winds climbed to 60 miles an hour and snow turned the air to solid white. In the town of Plainview, Nebraska, teacher Lois Royce ran out of fuel to heat her one-room schoolhouse by mid-afternoon. She decided to walk her 3 remaining students to a boarding house only about 80 yards away. Visibility had dropped to less than 5 feet, so close that Royce lost the path entirely. 2 9-year-old boys and a 6-year-old girl froze to death within sight of shelter. Royce survived, but frostbite cost her both feet. Walk a mile in any direction that afternoon, and bodies lay half buried in drifts, some still clutching lunch pails. Roughly 235 deaths were documented across the plains, many of them children caught between school and home. Families that morning had no way to know a storm was coming. The only warning system available was the sky itself, and the sky had lied. The day the planes flew away. Reporter Robert Geiger and photographer Harry Eisenhard were driving 6 miles outside Boise City, Oklahoma, on the afternoon of April 14, 1935, when the horizon turned black. Years of drought and overplowed farmland had stripped the topsoil bare across the southern plains, and a sudden change in the wind sent that loose dirt airborne as a dust wall 500 feet high, racing forward between 50 and 60 miles per hour. Geiger and Eisenhard were trapped inside their car for 2 hours. The static electricity generated by billions of grinding dust particles killed their ignition outright. Government bulletins from a decade earlier had called American soil an indestructible national asset, one the country could never use up. That confidence turned to ash. Stand anywhere on the plains that day, and birds dropped out of the sky, their lungs choked with dust, the same way rabbits and cattle were dying across the region. By nightfall, the storm had lifted an estimated 300 million tons of soil into the air, roughly twice as much dirt as was excavated building the entire Panama Canal. The next day, a reporter's dispatch gave the disaster its lasting name, the Dust Bowl. For the parents and grandparents of an entire American generation, that name still means the same thing it meant then. Congress passed the nation's first soil conservation law within the year. The fire that built tornadoes. If you think a wildfire only burns, wait until one starts to spin. On October 8, 1871, drought and logging debris turned the lumber town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin into a stack of dry kindling, and one shift of wind was all it took. The fire grew so intense it built its own weather, winds racing inward to feed the flames until the blaze produced rotating columns of solid fire. Survivors in the nearby settlement of Williamsonville reported these fire whirls through entire train cars and houses skyward. 7 men there jumped into a narrow well to escape the heat. 5 survived in the freezing water, while 35 neighbors sheltering on a cleared potato field, believing bare dirt would save them, burned where they stood. Crossed that tree line that night, and the whole sky seemed to catch fire, with burning coals raining down and setting new fires wherever they landed. Wisconsin's official count named 1,182 dead, though total estimates run past 2,000. The fire consumed close to 1.2 million acres, an area near the size of the entire state of Delaware. A later theory blamed a passing comet for the fire's strange behavior. Modern fire science offers a more earthly explanation for the reported blue flames. Carbon monoxide, a gas produced by incomplete burning, may have ignited inside poorly ventilated basements. The canyon that filled in minutes. Colorado turned 100 years old on August 1, 1976, and thousands of visitors packed Big Thompson Canyon the night before to celebrate. A stalled thunderstorm towering some 12 miles into the sky, nearly twice the cruising altitude of a jetliner, dumped up to 14 inches of rain over the canyon's headwaters in just 4 hours. Colorado State Patrol Sergeant Hugh Purdy drove straight into the canyon to warn drivers to reach higher ground, broadcasting over his loudspeaker until a wall of water from a side gulch hit his car directly. His last radio call reported that he was stuck in the middle of it and could not get out. A radar station miles away could have followed the storm, but its only fax link for transmitting images had broken the day before, so warnings went out by phone, too slow and too late. Anywhere along that canyon road, the air would have changed around you seconds before a 19-foot wall of water arrived, carrying 10-foot wide boulders downstream. 144 people died and 418 homes were destroyed. Search crews later identified Sergeant Purdy's crushed patrol car only by a keyring stamped with his department's name. The disaster pushed the National Weather Service to overhaul how it watches for flash floods in mountain canyons, an effort the agency says continued for decades afterward. The land hurricane no one named. Early on June 29, 2012, a line of thunderstorms formed over Iowa and kept moving for the next 12 hours. Meteorologists call this kind of wind event a derecho, a long-lived line of thunderstorms that drives damaging, straight-line winds across a broad path. The storm raced roughly 700 miles toward the Atlantic coast, about the same distance as driving from Chicago to Washington, with gusts reaching 91 miles per hour along the way. Falling trees killed 13 people outright, and the storm knocked out power to over 4 million customers just as a dangerous heat wave settled over the same region. The Weather Service later counted 34 additional heat-related deaths in the following week. In Northern Virginia, the power failure cascaded into a data center running cloud servers for Amazon, and when its backup systems failed too, Netflix and Instagram went dark for millions of users who had never felt a drop of rain. Drive that path yourself that evening, and a shelf of black cloud would have rolled overhead at highway speed, followed by wind capable of snapping power poles in half.
Before 2012, most Americans reserved their fear of wind for tornadoes and hurricanes, storms that spin. This one proved that wind moving in a straight line for long enough could do nearly as much damage as either. The stone that broke every scale. Rancher Les Scott stepped outside after a violent thunderstorm passed over Vivian, South Dakota on July 23, 2010, and found cantaloupe-sized ice chunks scattered across his yard. He grabbed the largest one and shoved it straight into his home freezer before it began to melt. Giant hail like this forms inside violent updrafts, columns of rising air acting like a vertical wind tunnel, strong enough to hold a chunk of ice aloft while layer after layer of water freezes onto it. Meteorologists later estimated this storm's updraft at 160 to 180 miles per hour, close to a Category 5 hurricane's wind turned straight upward.
Scott eventually drove his stone to the Vivian post office, where staff waited on the building's shipping scale while a federal meteorologist confirmed the numbers. At 8 inches across, it broke the United States records for both size and weight. If you had stood in that storm's path, hail would have hit rooftops like gunfire before the largest stones arrived. Video from a 2018 storm in Argentina suggests another stone may have exceeded 9 inches across, though it was never directly weighed, so Vivian's hailstone still holds the official U.S. record. A Penn State meteorologist who studied that Argentine storm called hail at this size the extreme upper end of what the atmosphere can produce. The ice that bent steel. Freezing rain is a routine winter nuisance across eastern Canada, usually gone within a few hours. The event that began on January 4, 1998, was not routine at all. A stalled weather pattern locked freezing rain over Quebec and eastern Ontario for 5 straight days, coating power lines and trees under nearly 4 inches of solid ice, about the diameter of a softball. The weight built gradually, day after day, until steel transmission towers began folding under the strain, crumpling like aluminum lawn chairs and dragging entire power grids down with them. More than 4.5 million people across Quebec and Ontario lost electricity, some for weeks during a Canadian winter. With no power and falling temperatures, desperate families brought propane heaters and charcoal grills indoors, and carbon monoxide, an odorless and invisible poisonous gas, killed some of them quietly in their sleep. Spend a night anywhere in that blackout, and the distant cracking of ice-coated branches would have sounded like rifle shots in the dark. Canada deployed more than 15,000 military personnel, the largest domestic troop deployment in Canadian history and its largest since the Korean War. Roughly 35 fatalities were tied to the storm in the end, including several who fell from icy rooftops weeks later, clearing the damage. Power stations kept generating electricity the entire time. The ice had simply crippled the grid built to carry it anywhere. If any of these hit closer to home than the others, tell us which one in the comments.